Sound recording, hello. Hello all! In this video we're going to be looking at the influence of ragtime on jazz music. Ragtime is something that began around the 1890s, and it played an important role in the creation of jazz, as we will find out. Creation. Was it ever created? I don't think so. What do I call it then? Origination. Coming to the fore of jazz. Ragtime is something that began around the 1890s, and it played an important role in the coming to the fore of jazz music, as we will find out. Okay, as I've said in my last video in this series, the book I am following for a foundation of all this it's just a very useful introductory overview. I am very critical of what I read. If I read anything that I think, I'm not so sure about that, I won't mention it. Or if it's so questionable, I will discuss it. I do have a PhD in music, so you can trust me. Without further ado, let's begin. So, ragtime, the sound. Like other forms of music, ragtime was played around New Orleans in the early 1900s. According to Britannica.com, see, I'm already researching other stuff. Ragtime was the predominant style of American popular music from about 1899 to 1917. Ragtime evolved in the playing of honky-tonk pianists along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers in the last decades of the 19th century. It was influenced by minstrel show songs, African American banjo styles, and syncopated, offbeat dance rhythms of the cakewalk and also elements of European music. Ragtime found its characteristic expression in formally structured piano compositions. Again, there's this combination between the formally structured and formally trained and the freer, the freer elements of music. Improvisation, syncopation and so on. The regularly accented left-hand beat in 4/4 or 2/4 time was opposed to the right hand by a fast, bouncingly syncopated melody that gave the music its powerful forward impetus. So we had that left hand doing its stride piano effect, boom, boom, or whatever, and then on the top. I'm sure you understand what I'm doing now. Pianists incorporated the syncopated rhythms of jazz melodies into their music. Sutro writes that, although both black and Creole musicians would have heard ragtime, the Creoles were more likely to play the music verbatim from sheet music because many of them had formal music training. What I'm gathering so far from all this research into jazz is that Creoles were formally trained musicians, and that the coming together of their formally trained practice and the freer, less formally trained music of black musicians is what had a crucial influence in the development of jazz music. It's almost like a clash of opposites. In a way. Are they opposite though? Are they really opposite? Do opposites exist? Sutro writes that ragtime was European influenced, in the sense that it was composed, not improvised, and featured carefully crafted melodies and harmonies. It didn't use the simple raw blues bass common in early jazz. Depending on the player, ragtime could sound concisely European, or it could become a loose, swinging precursor of jazz. It seems to me that during jazz's development, there is a distinction to be made between a European-influenced, formally composed form of ragtime and a ragtime that is freer and more like a precursor to jazz as we know it today. What's more is, unlike jazz as we might think about it now, ragtime contained little improvisation, but it did contain syncopation, also called ragged rhythms. Ragged rhythms. Now this syncopation was often notated rhythmically rather than applied instinctively. If I remember my A-level study of Scott Joplin's music correctly, he wrote out the syncopation in a classically trained manner so that people could just read the rhythms from the sheet music. Whereas since then, jazz and syncopation is just something you felt. You just applied it to music that was written straight, rhythmically straight. So the syncopation in ragtime was a marked development from the stricter rhythms of dance music and marching bands that had preceded it. Now let's have a look at some performers and composers of ragtime music. According to Sutro, the main three composers of ragtime were Scott Joplin, with his Maple Leaf Rag, James Scott, with his Hilarity Rag, and Joseph Lamb, with his American Beauty Rag. What about The Entertainer by Scott Joplin? I thought that one was really famous. The Maple Leaf Rag, though, is familiar to me. But The Entertainer is more familiar to me. Copyright-free music. Sutro writes that by 1910 ragtime was a national phenomenon. And in the quest for popularity, the music became lighter and sweeter, but the ragtime era came to a close in 1917 with Scott Joplin's passing, and by the end of World War I, elements of ragtime merged into varieties of jazz. So, let's have a look at Scott Joplin. Scott Joplin was born in Texas, but moved to Missouri, where he studied European music, including opera. Sutro writes that Joplin performed in Chicago during the World's Fair in 1893, where ragtime was heard for the first time by an estimated 27.5 million people in attendance. That's a lot. Over the next several years, ragtime became a popular craze, and the sheet music of Joplin's technically demanding Maple Leaf Rag eventually sold more than 1 million copies. Apparently Scott Joplin also wrote several musicals, but of course he is best known for his rags. He also wrote an opera called Treemonisha. I also remember learning about Joplin during my A-levels, and I learned that he was a classical trained musician. His father was a slave and his mother was African American. And because of this combination, he had the syncopation in his music, but it was classically notated as if it was European music. So he demonstrated this definite coming together of European classically trained musician with someone who had that background in the freer, bluesier, the heartfelt music, spirituals and work songs and so on. And so you ended up with Scott Joplin's quintessential ragtime sound piano music, which, incidentally, everyone just copied afterwards. I think Scott Joplin has to be the pioneer of ragtime music. I can't find anyone before him writing in that style on a piano. Not to say that there wasn't anyone, because, you know, we only know of history what people write down. But from what I've read, Scott Joplin seems to be the pioneer of this sound, and everyone since him just copied. As we'll find out, the next person we're going to look at is Joseph Lamb. Now, Joseph Lamb was born in New Jersey and was one of Scott Joplin's students. Apparently Lamb was inspired by his two sisters who received formal music training. Now, Lamb apparently didn't receive this formal music training himself. I don't know why. It seems weird. But I'm thinking about it from this perspective today, aren't I? So I don't know what it was like back then for people. Okay, so apparently Lamb was inspired by his two sisters. Yeah. He didn't receive this training himself, but he picked up piano by watching his sisters and studying musical scores, according to this book. And now, if you listen to Lamb's music, it resembles that of Joplin's, although there are some harmonic differences I've noticed. I mean, to me, Lamb's music seems a bit more romantic and somewhat looser rhythmically, whereas Joplin's is bouncy and rhythmically tight. In the main, though, Lamb's music is essentially Joplin pastiche. The first thing you hear is that. The next composer-performer we're looking at is someone called James Scott. He was born in Missouri with perfect pitch. Sutro writes that James Scott learned piano as a child by listening to his mother, a former slave, play folk, blues and gospel songs. And Scott Joplin had ties to James Scott as well. Remember, they all knew each other. After Scott Joplin heard James Scott's rags, he helped him land a publishing deal, and James Scott's Frog Legs rag in 1906 sold almost as many as Joplin's best-selling Maple Leaf rag. It's essentially the same song though, so, you know. They do sound very similar, and sadly, like everything in life, ragtime's popularity didn't last that long. There's an explanation as to why that is in here, which I'll read out. Oh, this is good. This is gossip worthy. Right. Jazz began to eclipse ragtime in popularity in the 1920s, so James Scott wrote a protest song entitled Don't Jazz Me, Rag, I'm Music in 1921. By the late 20s, the popularity of ragtime was declining and Scott couldn't find a publisher for his new compositions. So this is an example of someone who, I mentioned this in the last video in this series, basically jazz was developing. Even though someone of the time where a new style was, I don't know, developed like ragtime, they didn't want it to go beyond that moment and develop further, and had to keep harking back to the previous style. But I'm saying this now, and if you think about it though, was James Scott really a pioneer in the development, or was he just writing pastiche Joplin? I think he was writing pastiche Joplin. I think he just loved ragtime. When music developed on from ragtime, he didn't like it. Once you start doing pastiche of anything and establishing that something has a style, you've reified it, you've ruined its whole purpose. It becomes its own image. It becomes the act of looking like it is, rather than what it stood for in the first place, which was an expression of creativity on a blend of different cultures. So that's interesting. So he didn't want it to develop. Feel free to disagree with me. These are just thoughts at the minute. Basically, this is a learning curve. These series provide a learning... Yeah. It's a proper word, that is. Right. Stride piano now. Ragtime developed a style of piano playing called stride. And again, like most things in this video, Sutra explains this much better than me. He writes that after ragtime became a popular phenomenon that sold thousands of copies of sheet music, the piano style, with its jaunty left-hand bass lines and twinkling right-hand melodies, evolved into the style known as stride. Stride refers to the striding pattern of the pianist's left hand, which jumps between low notes and chords and notes an octave higher, resulting in a sort of oompa bass pattern. The right hand, meanwhile, plays light, fast melodies. Stride was important because it was a style that, during the 20s, bridged the transition between ragtime and swing. I love swing music. 1930s, we'll get onto that soon enough. Now to look at some important stride pianists and their contribution to the development of jazz. We have someone called Eubie Blake. Eubie Blake was born in Baltimore and later joined the military band. He was too old to serve at the time, and so he instead composed music for the band. Again, this is another example of where the development of jazz is tied in with marching bands. Eubie Blake collaborated a lot with someone called Noble Sissle, and after the war the two produced some successful works such as I'm Just Wild About Harry and the Broadway show Shuffle Along. Unfortunately, in 1925, their musical The Chocolate Dandies was unsuccessful. After touring Europe together, they eventually broke up, but then reunited for Blake's 1968 album, The 86 Years of Eubie Blake, which wasn't available on CD at the time this book was written. This is the second edition. You know, everything's online now, so have a look. Finally, we have James P. Johnson, born in New Jersey, and as a young musician studied and played classical music and popular songs including the Ragtime of Scott Joplin and others. Interestingly, he was the first of the legendary Harlem Stride pianists, a group that included Duke Ellington and Fats Waller, and who were heavily influenced by Johnson. Waller even took lessons from him. Fats Waller took lessons from James P. Johnson. The more you know. Yeah, it's interesting, they all did know each other. It was a very close-knit society, wasn't it, when you think about it? What does this mean for music today? Are we all just going to blend into one uniformed world? Oh no, I don't want there to be just a uniformed, watered-down, corporate, commodified style of music. Anyway, we've discussed the sound of ragtime and how this developed the style of stride piano. We've also briefly touched on the notion that ragtime was replaced by a more popular form of jazz in the 1920s. We'll look more into what followed after this in a later video, maybe even the next video in this series. We've also looked at some key figures in the development of ragtime and stride piano, and this has helped us, hopefully, understand why the sound of ragtime was the way it was. And here's my explanation as to why I think it was the way it was. Basically, European classically trained cultures came together with African American cultures to create a syncopated, freer form of piano music, incorporating notated syncopation, striding bass lines, and jaunty melodies in the right hand, striding bass lines in the left hand. The piano dominated the style at this time, but we'll learn later about the incorporation of other instruments. So I'm enjoying learning about all this, and I'm looking forward to learning more in the coming months. If you want to join me, please do. Until next time, bye!